3 U.S. Air Force B-52 strategic bombers were tracked orbiting for hours over the Caribbean Sea inside the Maiquetía Flight Information Region, a sector of airspace monitored and controlled by Venezuela. Their appearance was not accidental. For Caracas, it was a deliberate reminder that American power still casts its shadow over Latin America. For Washington, it was just another routine patrol. But nothing about the presence of nuclear-capable bombers near Venezuelan territory felt routine. According to flight data publicly available, the bombers took off from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana and crossed south over the Caribbean. They flew near the northern edge of the Los Sukhois archipelago, close enough to trigger attention from Venezuelan air defense radars, before turning east and exiting toward the Atlantic Ocean. They never entered Venezuelan sovereign airspace, but remained inside the FIR, which requires communication with Venezuelan civil aviation authorities. That was enough to provoke a full political and military response. For Venezuela, this was not simply an air patrol, it was a message. One sent directly to President Nicolás Maduro's government at a time when diplomatic isolation and economic pressure are again tightening around Caracas. It came just weeks after a series of U.S. strikes against fast boats accused of smuggling narcotics from Venezuelan waters into the Caribbean. Those operations, carried out under the banner of counter-narcotics, killed several people and were criticized internationally for bypassing the United Nations Security Council. The U.S. justified the attacks as part of its ongoing fight against criminal networks such as the so-called Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan gang blamed for drug and human trafficking across the region. But for Caracas, the narrative was clear. Washington was turning anti-narcotics warfare into an excuse for intervention. In a televised address, President Maduro accused the United States of violating international law and of trying to provoke an armed incident to justify deeper involvement. He convened an emergency session of his National Defense Council and ordered the armed forces to a state of prevented red alert. Shortly after, Venezuela launched large-scale military exercises at Orchila Island, a strategic outpost north of the mainland, used for air operations and naval surveillance. Thousands of soldiers participated. The message, domestically and abroad, was simple: Venezuela would not be intimidated. But behind the slogans, the reality was more complex. Analysts inside Caracas admit that Venezuela's military, though large on paper, faces major logistical and technological limits. Its fleet of Russian-made Sukhoi jets is aging, spare parts are scarce due to sanctions, and radar coverage along the northern coastline is patchy. That is why, according to observers, the government has shifted toward what they call strategic patience. Avoid confrontation, strengthen diplomacy, and survive politically long enough for the U.S. domestic agenda to change. During the hours when the B-52 circled overhead, Venezuela's civil and military controllers were on constant communication channels, monitoring the bomber's trajectory. Air Force units in Maracay and Barcelona were reportedly placed on standby, but no intercept order was given. That restraint was deliberate. A miscalculated interception could trigger a global incident, something Venezuela can't afford while under heavy sanctions and international scrutiny. The Defense Ministry later issued a statement describing the operation as a flagrant provocation. It accused the United States of violating international law and of trying to provoke an armed incident to justify deeper involvement. Foreign Minister Ivan Gil also spoke publicly, calling on Latin American nations to reject what he called imperial arrogance in the skies of the Caribbean. Diplomatically, Caracas began working its channels quickly. Russian and Chinese officials expressed support for Venezuela's right to defend its airspace, while U.S. officials maintained that the flights were entirely legal. The truth lies somewhere between legality and legitimacy. One deals with rules, the other with perception. And perception in Latin American politics is often the sharper weapon. From Washington's point of view, the B-52 mission fits into a wider campaign of presence. For decades, the U.S. Southern Command, SOUTHCOM, has operated across the Caribbean and Central America to deter illicit trafficking and monitor what it calls malign influence from external powers. In recent years, as Venezuela's alliances with Russia, Iran, and China have deepened, U.S. surveillance has increased proportionately. To U.S. strategists, showing that bombers can operate freely in the region reaffirms deterrence, not only to Caracas, but also to Moscow and Beijing. Still, Latin America remembers history differently. From Guatemala in the 1950s to Chile in the 1970s, American aircraft often preceded political change. For Venezuelans who grew up hearing those stories, the image of a B-52 circling nearby stirs not reassurance but memory. A reminder that power rarely travels alone. It always brings consequences. Inside Venezuela, the government used the incident to rally domestic unity. State television broadcast continuous coverage of military drills, patriotic songs, and commentary describing the United States as testing the limits of patience. Opposition leaders, though often critical of Maduro, also condemned the B-52 flights as unnecessary escalation. For a moment, the nation, fragmented by politics and crisis, found a rare point of agreement. National sovereignty mattered. Meanwhile, the Venezuelan armed forces conducted electronic warfare simulations, radar calibration tests, and naval tracking drills in coordination with civil authorities. Military analysts in Caracas said those exercises were less about combat readiness and more about institutional confidence, reminding officers that the system still functions, even under sanctions. The move also helped reassure allies like Russia and Iran that Venezuela remains a reliable partner, capable of defending its territory, at least symbolically. Beyond the headlines, the stakes were economic as well. Venezuela is slowly rebuilding oil production after years of sanctions. Any perception of instability, even a hint of conflict, threatens to scare away the few investors still willing to take the risk. That's why Caracas framed its response carefully, defiant enough to appear strong, cautious enough to avoid panic in financial markets. Across the Caribbean, regional governments watched closely. Some, like Cuba and Nicaragua, publicly supported Venezuela's protests. Others, including Colombia and Trinidad, quietly advised restraint, fearing that any escalation could destabilize trade and tourism routes vital to their economies. The Organization of American States remained largely silent, unwilling to take sides in a standoff that could widen the fracture between North and South.